Interesting, when I was asked to give this presentation, and I want to thank NEDC for that honored invitation, I realized that I had been in the field 40 years. Working with eating disorders was very different in 1980. Most people in this room probably weren't even born. And there have been many changes. So when I'm talking about evidence-based treatment and recovery, I thought, in 1980, bulimia nervosa had only been identified and entered into the DSM in 1979. So no one knew about bulimia. I mean, it didn't exist, right? Like binge eating disorder didn't exist till 2013. But we had no evidence-based treatments. People used to be put into hospital if they were very ill, put into behavioral programs where they had to eat to see their parents, had to eat to watch television, etc., to leave their room. Outpatient therapy, no evidence-based treatments. So the world has come quite far since then. We have a long way to go. And then I thought of recovery. 1980, we never talked about recovery. We clinicians, got people better, or people got better. Very medical terms. You either had your disorder or you didn't. Very much like a medical illness. So I think one of the advances we've had is the process, the journey of recovery. So that's really where I'm heading today, is looking forward and looking back. Yes. So what is our current climate? Yesterday, Beth referred to it as a toxic culture, and I think that was so appropriate because that's really where I'm focusing on. We live in a society which values thinness in females and increasingly values muscularity in males. Now, 40 years ago, we did value thinness in females. We had lived through the 60s and Twiggy and models. But I think men got a pass on that. There wasn't so much pressure on males to have a certain body. So that's changed. Maybe hard for some of you to believe, but we didn't have social media. We didn't have the internet. So yes, we had visions of unattainable bodies, but they were in magazines and on television. And in the last 40 years, photoshopping and social media have made it so that these bodies have become even more unattainable and the standards even more extreme. We know that people with eating disorders engage in unhealthy behaviors and emotions, related to emotions. So we know that self-image and body image are related to how we feel about ourselves and how we might want to change ourselves. Okay, but we know that eating disorders isn't just about eating. But it does involve unhealthy eating, so we can't get away from that. And the eating involves and is related to unhealthy behavior and unhealthy thoughts. And so treatment, recovery-based treatment, and evidence-based treatments involve helping the person improve their eating, the behaviors that are related to that, the thought patterns related to that, but also improving people's coping skills and building a more healthy inner resources to cope with the environment in which we live and the environmental pressures that continue. But recovery isn't just about changing behaviors and thoughts. Going back a bit, just focusing on the risks for developing an eating disorder, we do know that we know a lot more about genes and genetic vulnerability right now. And we've always known genes and environment. But what we do know now is that about half the risk of developing an eating disorder comes from genetics. And this risk varies from person to person. But there is a high level of genetic vulnerability. And people with this higher genetic vulnerability might spend their whole lives without developing an eating disorder. But for those, if they have a safe, protective, happy environment, they may never develop an eating disorder. People who are vulnerable genetically only need a slightly toxic environment to increase their chances of developing an eating disorder. And epigenetics, the study of biological mechanisms that cause these genetic predispositions to get switched on, have shown that in certain environments, especially where there's high stress and low nutrition, that these genes can get switched on. And as Cindy Bulick, international expert on eating disorders, has said, genes load the gun, environment pulls the trigger. And I'd go one step further and say genes load the gun, weight loss pulls the trigger. Because whether the weight loss is intentional through dieting or unintentional, through grieving, through illness, it's weight loss that I think makes that switch in our vulnerable brains. Okay, so we know that recovery, we know now, we didn't know 40 years ago, recovery is a very personal journey, and that ideally, eating disorder treatment will happen early in the illness. It will be focused on the person's needs and the needs of the family, and that is something which has changed over 40 years, involving the family. We know that access to evidence-based treatments is important, and at times access to specialist treatment is important. We also know that however ideal early intervention is, that certainly increases the chances of early recovery. We know that recovery can occur at any stage of the illness, so that we shouldn't give up. So evidence-based treatment has been described as a three-legged tool. And so evidence-based practice involving research evidence, clinical expertise, and patient values. And I think this is a really good model for the idea of evidence-based practice. And it sort of reminded me of the NEDC logo isn't quite the right word, but evidence, expertise, and experience. And I thought, well, okay, you could say, evidence is the researchers, expertise is the clinicians, experience is the lived experience. But actually, all three provide evidence. All three provide expertise. And all three provide experience. And as we know, when you take one leg of the three-legged stool off, what happens? It falls over. And I think we have come a long way in establishing this solid stool. Sorry about that. Dietitians will love that. We've done a lot of research in the last 40 years. That's quite impressive. There's quite an impressive output of research. It's still really hard to get funded. I think we've got some really good clinicians. Some clinical expertise is certainly so different from what it was 40 years ago. We have really well-trained clinicians who are well-versed and know where to head. I think we're still lacking in relating our treatments to patient values and patient preference and patient characteristics. We're not very good at fitting treatments to people. But we are valuing the lived experience voice. And I think this is where the field is moving forward, and I think that is an extremely good and positive thing, because the three-legged stool will get more robust. Okay, so on to evidence-based treatments. What are we talking about? There are certain treatments that have had the most research done on them, and that doesn't mean they're the only treatments that are helpful. But when we talk about evidence-based treatments, we have to have a sort of common language, and it is the treatments that have been researched and show the best promise. So family-based treatment, many of you will be familiar. It's also known as FBT or Maudsley method, less so nowadays. FBT was designed as a treatment for adolescents with anorexia nervosa. Then for adults or youth and adults, we have cognitive behavior therapy enhanced and cognitive behavior therapy for eating disorders. This is a transdiagnostic treatment, which means it can be used for people with anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, purging disorder, night eating, etc., 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 across adolescence and adulthood. Then there are two evidence-based treatments for adults with anorexia nervosa, and that is SSEM, Specialist Supported Clinical Management, and MANTRA, Maudsley Anorexia Nervosa Treatment for Adults. Now, these are all outpatient treatments. And although most treatment does occur in the outpatient setting, in outpatient clinics, whether that is private practice or public-funded clinics, it's important to remember that there are many levels of care. I've talked about primary care and early intervention. We talked a bit about that yesterday. If only there were better early intervention, there would be less a need for other levels of treatment. So most treatment goes on in the outpatient setting. But sometimes that isn't sufficient. And people need higher levels of care, which can involve day treatment or inpatient treatment. And the inpatient treatment can also be mental health or medical admissions. But people don't go in a straight line through their disorder. They might get ill very quickly and go straight from GP into an inpatient medical unit. So just want to bear in mind that there are these levels of treatment and that what I'm really talking about is outpatient treatment here, where the evidence is strongest. So what does treatment target? Evidence-based treatments, what do they target? Well, we know that people with eating disorders, we've talked about how people have unhelpful behaviors and unhelpful thought patterns. And so evidence-based treatments do work on changing behaviors and thinking. Because what we know is that the brain is like a muscle. It's constantly changing as a result of how we use it or how we exercise it. And it can be exercised through learning and practicing new ways of thinking and behaving and interacting. And with practice, people have eating disorders. Their brains can show activity that looks more like someone without an eating disorder than someone with an eating disorder. So the encouraging thing is brains can change. And so treatments need to be addressing this. But more than just what do people need, people who have a starved brain need, guess what? Food. Because the brain needs to be adequately nourished to be able to take on the challenging tasks of change. And therefore, nutritional rehabilitation is a focus of all treatments of people who need to regain weight. And of course, we know this is challenging because eating more or eating differently for someone with an eating disorder can be terrifying. The other thing to remember, or if you don't know, the brain takes longer to recover than the body. It lags behind in terms of recovery. So someone who might recover physically, but still their brain is very cognitively affected by starvation, and still their cognitions, their thoughts, their fears, their beliefs may still be very distorted, whilst their body has seemingly recovered. And it's important to remember, because many people, when their bodies recover, everyone says, oh, you look fine, you're good, goodbye. And we need to remember that there is this, the brain lag needs attending to. The brain, the person. So back to our rather toxic environment. When someone is in the process of receiving treatment or recovering, they're still in the same environment that they started in, with the unachievable images, inaccurate, conflicting messages of what to eat, what to exercise, what not to do, what to do. And so evidence-based treatments need to address not only the person's vulnerability, genetic vulnerability, physical status, but help them develop skills to manage these environmental influences, managing stress, avoiding dieting. These are very difficult challenges. But recovery is possible with adequate nutrition, with adequate learning, with adequate rehearsing and repeating behaviors, healthy behaviors. Full recovery is possible. So, how do these treatments facilitate recovery? All evidence-based treatments have certain common factors to support the move into recovery. First of all, they all focus on eating, on the eating disorder, and on changing eating disorder behaviors. Now, they may also address other things like depression, stress, trauma, self-esteem, but they still have as their main focus the eating and the eating behaviors. Engagement. Engagement is very important. We heard about this yesterday from our lived experience speakers. If you don't engage the person, they're going to feel invalidated and undervalued, and they may not come back. It's important to engage families and supports if the person does have family or support that can help and intervene in their recovery. And engagement's so important because what we're asking people to do in treatment is incredibly difficult and challenging for them, and we need, as clinicians, to keep remembering that. We're asking them to eat more or eat differently, which terrifies them. We're asking them to change their behaviors. And maybe these behaviors they've used for years, decades, to help cope with life. So what we're asking is something very difficult. And therefore we need to develop a therapeutic alliance and trust. And of course, what we were talking about yesterday, the balance of empathy and firmness that came out through the lived experience talks. It's being supportive, but also nudging people forwards, slightly out of their comfort zone, otherwise they're going to just stay unwell. So what does this engagement look like in evidence-based treatments? In CBTE, it involves a collaborative team approach where we talk about working together towards a goal. In Mantra, it involves aligning the person with the person against the eating disorder, kind of externalizing the eating disorder, helping the person become strong to face and fight the eating disorder. In SSCM, the person with the eating disorder guides half of the session, so they're very involved and can make choices around the content of the session. And in FBT, the engagement is mostly with the parents. Of course, it involves engagement with the individual, but it's the parents that need that initial engagement to give them the confidence and empower them to be able to do the challenging work of refeeding their unwell child. Evidence-based treatments also all involved providing education, information. Information is power. Having no information leaves you feeling powerless and confused. So these are important bits of information about eating disorders, the results of eating disorders, the results of physical, mental results, giving them to the person and their supports so that they can have a greater understanding of what is going on with them, mentally and physically. And it does allow for them to make more informed choices and increasing their motivation to change. Evidence-based treatments also involve early behavior change. We know from research, especially on FBT and CBT, that early change predicts better outcomes, better chance of recovery of the treatment helping the person. So there's an emphasis on early change, and this can mean changing the way the person eats, eating more for weight regain. I think Shane is going to be talking more about the eating part of all of this. It involves reducing eating disordered behaviors and reducing compensatory behaviors early on. There's no time to waste. We want people to hit the floor running and work hard and successfully so that they have a better chance of recovery. In terms of cognitive change, in classical CBT and CBTE, this involves challenging the cognitions, the beliefs, the fears, the thoughts, primarily through behavioral experiments, trying things out differently. If someone believes that eating a piece of bread is going to make them gain 2 kilos, so they avoid bread, then actually helping them disprove their fears. In mantra, it involves changing thought patterns, helping the person think more flexibly by doing tasks differently. For example, driving to work on a different route to help them make them think differently about what they're doing. SSCM and FBT don't directly focus on changing the cognitions, but they do have a strong emphasis on improving nutrition, which in turn improves the capacity for abstract thought and rational thinking. Oops, now one slide I did forget to talk about is relapse prevention. And that is important because we know that eating disorders have a high relapse rate. And all disorders, or all treatments involve planning for when people have lapses in the future and the importance of getting back on track straight away. Because we know that people may have lapses and how important it is for them to just get back on track. And also, we know that the end of treatment does not mean the end of their recovery journey. So it's important to give people some skills that they can use after treatment has ended. So, tying this all up, why is this important? Whether you're involved in planning services, delivering services, receiving treatment, thinking about receiving treatment, it's really important to understand that eating disorders involve physical, psychological, neurobiological, social changes, and that therapy needs to be focused on the eating disorder, but all these aspects, changing unhelpful behaviors and thoughts. Recovery is a very complex journey. It involves learning to think and behave differently, develop new coping skills, hugely challenging. And it involves much, much more. It involves reintegrating into society as someone without an eating disorder, with skills that they didn't have before. But evidence-based treatments can be regarded as a foundation to enhance the chance of future change and full recovery, which is possible at any stage and any age. Thank you.